Kish. But at the moment, I would like to welcome Dr. Martin Kramer, President Emeritus of Shalom College and Koret Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, to talk about the Balfour Declaration and the Jewish problem. Dr. Kramer, thank you for coming.
Good morning. It's a distinct pleasure to be with you this morning in my capacity as a historian. And one of the most striking aspects of historical accounts of the Balfour Declaration is the narrowness of the question that historians ask. Usually it's this: why did Lloyd George's war cabinet do it? In retrospect, it seems so improbable. The Jewish writer Arthur Koestler called the Balfour Declaration, and I quote him, an act dangerously outside the cautious routine of diplomacy. The whole thing was unorthodox, unpolitic, freakish. End of quote. So that being so, the Declaration from its announcement invited obsessive speculation as to its real motives. Do I have control of this, or you? Thank you. This is the War Cabinet circa 1916. Now, initially, the speculation ranged very widely, but much of it subsided when Britain opened the archives in the 1970s. We now know that the Balfour Declaration was very politic indeed. I won't detain you regarding the answers. The bottom line is that the British War Cabinet thought a declaration supporting a Jewish national home in Palestine would be good propaganda among the Jews of Russia and America, both tepid allies. These Jews would then use their supposed influence to keep Russia in the war and get America more involved. The British War Cabinet also thought British sponsorship of Zionism would give Britain an edge over France in the post-war disposition of Palestine. Britain, by assuming the noble burden of helping the Jews, would extricate itself from its 1916 promise to share Palestine with France according to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Here you see the map. The brown area, which is Palestine, was to have been an international administered territory among all the Allies. It was something Lloyd George wanted to achieve for reasons of imperial strategy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've simplified a very large corpus of historical research here, but you get the idea. It was realpolitik all along. Some have tried to show that Lloyd George and Balfour were motivated by religious sentiment. If they were, it doesn't show in the cabinet papers. The British there debated Palestine like they debated India or Egypt. They were thinking about preserving and expanding the red on the world map. John Kimche's book on the Balfour Declaration is entitled The Unromantics for just this reason. The declaration, he concluded, was, quote, a strictly functional and unromantic bargain with the Zionists. And I would add, that's nothing to be ashamed of. Now, Zionist leaders, above all Chaim Weizmann, understood these British motives perfectly well. Weizmann also knew that once the guns fell silent in Europe, once Britain had Palestine firmly in its pocket, the British needs that prompted the declaration would vanish. What then would hold Britain to its vague wartime promise? What need would outlast the war? Weizmann's answer was what he called the Jewish problem. Now, there are historians who are totally oblivious to the Jewish problem. There is, for example, a historian at Oxford, just elected to the British Academy, who has repeatedly made this statement, and I quote, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, the Jews constituted 10% of the population of Palestine, 60,000 Jews and 600,000 Arabs. Yet Britain chose to recognize the right to national self-determination of the tiny minority and to flatly deny it to the undisputed majority. End of quote. Now let's leave aside the question of whether national home meant national self-determination. The Balfour Declaration promised to advance in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people, not for the 60,000 already in Palestine, but for the Jewish people in its entirety. Now, there were, at the time, about 12 million Jews in the world, a little less than 9 million of them in Europe, and more than 5 million of them in the Russian Empire, which then included Poland. The Balfour Declaration was for them, against whom, I might add, the 600,000 Arabs of Palestine were but a tiny minority. And here you see the major concentration of Jewry in Eastern Europe. Now, post-Holocaust, we have come to think of the Jews as a small people. But at the time, there were as many Jews in the world as Egyptians in Egypt. And today, there are 97 million Egyptians. There were more Jews in Russia alone than there were Arabs in the entire Levant, Palestine, Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon combined. And the Jews posed a substantial problem. Not the whole of them, but those 5+ million in the Russian Empire. The Jewish problem for the world was that it seemed like they might begin to move. Why? The Second World War distorts our view of the First. We've forgotten just how devastating the First World War was for the Jews of the Russian Empire. The front lines on the east, between Germany and Austria on the one side and Russia on the other, swept back and forth through the pale of Jewish settlement like a threshing machine. Thousands of Jews perished as collateral damage or from deliberate atrocities. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes and became wanderers on the roadsides and the train depots. The Russian army deported 600,000 in boxcars to the east. As Weizmann put it in 1916, and I quote him, "It is already obvious that the war will deal a shattering blow at what has been for centuries the great reservoir of Jewish strength. The havoc brought by the war to the Jews of Poland has been compared to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, and the comparison is by no means fanciful." Now think of that arresting analogy for a moment. By drawing it, Weizmann meant to say that the Jews were about to be dispersed once again. If so, this meant the movement of millions. Already 2 million had left the Russian Empire, mostly for America, but also for the East End of London. Sentiment against them was rising. Doors were beginning to close. Balfour himself, as Prime Minister, had tried to close the door to Britain through the Aliens Act of 1905. Who would take in another million, or 2, or 4? No country, Weizmann claimed, could absorb such numbers, no country except Palestine. But could it? Where was the evidence? This question first came up in the week prior to the cabinet meeting on the Balfour Declaration. It was prompted by Lord Curzon, once described as the most traveled man who ever sat in a British cabinet. He inspired a famous piece of Oxford doggerel that began, "My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a most superior person." Curzon visited Palestine in 1882, and 35 years later remembered it as, I quote, "a tiny country which has lost its fertility and only supports meager herds of sheep and goats with occasional terraced plot of cultivation." That was in a letter to Edwin Montagu. This remote recollection prompted him to write a memo to the War Cabinet at the end of October 1917 entitled "The Future of Palestine." And he painted a grim picture indeed. Palestine, he pronounced, was incapacitated by physical and other conditions from ever becoming, in any real sense, the national home of the Jewish people. Palestine, he said, was comparable in size to Wales. Wales, he wrote, and I quote, "supports a population of only 2 million. Yet the Jews in the world number 12 million, half of them in Russia. Because Palestine," again I'm quoting, "cannot within any proximate period contain anything but a small population, the country will not, in my judgment, provide either a national, a material, or even a spiritual home for any more than a very small section of the Jewish people." His unspoken conclusion, Palestine couldn't possibly solve the Jewish problem. Britain would be committing itself to a romantic notion, not a practical ideal. Who could challenge the seemingly formidable Lord Curzon? This fell to the much younger Mark Sykes, a celebrated traveler in his own right, and in many ways the unsung hero of the Balfour Declaration. It was Sykes who shepherded the process, guiding Weizmann and Nachum Sokolov to go here and move there. Generally, he let the Zionists make their own case, as they did it extraordinarily well. But as against Curzon, he had to act himself, as only he could claim to know Palestine better than him. And he acted in a counter-memo written 4 days later. In the course of a few pages, Sykes demonstrated a superior and detailed knowledge of the country, its climate, its agricultural produce, its existing settlements. Having known Palestine since 1886, he concluded, I am of the opinion that if the population is now 700,000, that granted security, roads, and a modest railway accommodation, it is capable of being doubled in 7 years. And with energy and expenditure, it would be quadrupled and quintupled within 40 years. So doing the math, Sykes was arguing for upwards of 3 million at a brisk pace of 100,000 immigrants a year. Unspoken conclusion, Palestine could go very far into indeed alleviating the Jewish problem. Now, it would be a mistake to think that the cabinet decision hinged on this debate. Political calculation decided that there would be a Balfour Declaration. And by the end of October 1917, Balfour and Sykes had the necessary support, not just in the cabinet, but from Britain's allies. But very soon, the Balfour Declaration would be shorn of its wartime rationales, but still not fleshed out in practice. To get the Balfour Declaration ratified internationally, it would need a new rationale. And that rationale would be this: only the Jewish national home on as large a territory as possible had a chance of solving the Jewish problem. Absent a solution, not only the Jews would suffer. Weizmann in 1918 practically threatened Balfour that the Jews might overturn the world. I quote him, "If the Jews do not obtain a satisfactory settlement this time, they will be driven to despair. I would go further and say now that the world will never have peace until the Jewish problem is solved in a satisfactory manner." End of quote. Now, Weizmann knew how to build on Gentile admiration of the Jews, but he had no illusions. Admiration and fear often went together. And he thought that the larger the Jewish problem loomed, the more appealing the Zionist solution would appear. So Sykes, by deflating Curzon, had rendered a crucial service to Zionism. As the war wound down, Weizmann shifted his emphasis to the Jewish problem. And thanks to Sykes, he could speak of big numbers with less fear of contradiction. If he talked small, he would receive little. So he talked very large. For example, by late 1918, Weizmann was warning Balfour that mass emigration from Russia was imminent. In December, he told Balfour that, quote, "When things settle down a little after this war, Jewish emigration will assume formidable proportions." He also anticipated that, as he put it, countries which have hitherto admitted considerable numbers of Jewish refugees may make any further influx of such refugees very difficult. Balfour, Weizmann noted, concurred in this view. Palestine was the only solution, and Weizmann now named a stupendous figure. Quote him, "We should be able to settle in Palestine about 4 to 5 million Jews within a generation, and so make Palestine a Jewish country." And this was also the figure he used at the Paris Peace Conference. The message: give us a wide Palestine, inexpansive borders, and we'll solve our Jewish problem and yours. By the time the Balfour Declaration entered the League of Nations mandate, it had been transformed from a wartime expedient to a peacetime necessity. But did Palestine solve the Jewish problem? Here we come to the tragedy of the Balfour Declaration. In the 1920s, Weizmann and his colleagues came up against the harsh realities of economics. The Yishuv didn't have a broad enough base to absorb millions of Jews. Young pioneers were welcomed, so were moneyed entrepreneurs. Others were not. They would have been a burden. But they weren't lining up either. In the lands of the former Russian Empire, the situation of the Jews improved temporarily. True, there were horrific pogroms in the Russian Civil War of 1919. Perhaps 50,000 Jews perished, a forgotten chapter. But the Soviet Union, at least at first, gave Jews equal rights and national standing. For most Jews there, that was hope enough. In Poland, a new republic promised minority rights, and for a brief moment there was hope there too. Now, all that changed with the worldwide depression in 1929 and the rise of Hitler in 1933. But by then, the doors were closing. In 1937, a partition plan was proposed by the Royal Peel Commission. The part of Palestine available to the Jews, and you see it here on the map in red, shrank dramatically. Weizmann was pressed to answer this question. Did he still think to bring half of the Jewish people, 6 million, to Palestine? His answer, no. And I'm quoting him, "I am acquainted with the laws of physics and chemistry and know the force of material factors. In our generation, I divide the figure by 3. 2 millions of youth with their lives before them. 2 millions and perhaps less. Sherit haplita. Only a remnant shall survive. We have to accept it." End of quote. Ultimately, even those 2 million would perish, leaving only a few 100,000 to be collected from the ashes. In the entire period of the British Mandate, some 30 years, only about 400,000 Jews entered Palestine. All the talk of the millions was a dream. But was this an unmitigated tragedy? Weizmann would have thought not. He put it thus: if the question of the Jewish refugee gives a new spur to the Zionist effort, it is not, and never was, the primal motive. Zionism envisages more than the negative relief of suffering. Zionism was not to be judged by the quantity of lives it saved, but by the quality of the sovereign Jewish life it fostered. And sovereign we have been. The Balfour Declaration didn't just open the path to Israel. It was the beginning of the end of the Jewish problem, that total absence of power that made the Jews forever wanderers. And for that, we should be thankful. Thank you.